Chapter 11 of The Master of Ballantrae by Robert Louis Stevenson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Chapter 11. The Journey in the Wilderness. We made a prosperous voyage up that fine river of the Hudson, the weather grateful, the hills singularly beautified with the colours of the autumn. At Albany we had our residence at an inn, where I was not so blind, and my lord not so cunning, but what I could see he had some design to hold me prisoner. The work he found for me to do was not so pressing that we should transact it apart from necessary papers in the chamber of an inn, nor was it of such importance that I should be set upon as many as 4 or 5 scrolls of the same document. I submitted in appearance, but I took private measures on my own side, and had the news of the town communicated to me daily by the politeness of our host. In this way I received at last a piece of intelligence, for which I may say I had been waiting. Captain Harris, I was told, with Mr. Mountain, the trader, had gone by up the river in a boat. I would have feared the landlord's eye, so strong a sense of some complicity upon my master's part oppressed me, but I made out to say I had some knowledge of the captain, although none of Mr. Mountain, and to inquire who else was of the party. My informant knew not. Mr. Mountain had come ashore upon some needful purchases, had gone round the town buying, drinking, and prating, and it seemed the party went upon some likely venture, for he had spoken much of great things he would do when he returned. No more was known, for none of the rest had come ashore, and it seemed they were pressed for time to reach a certain spot before the snow should fall. And sure enough, the next day there fell a sprinkle even in Albany. But it passed as it came, and was but a reminder of what lay before us. I thought of it lightly then, knowing so little as I did of that inclement province. The retrospect is different, and I wonder at times if some of the horror of these events which I must now rehearse flowed not from the foul skies and savage winds to which we were exposed, and the agony of cold that we must suffer. The boat having passed by, I thought at first we should have left the town, but no such matter. My lord continued his stay in Albany, where he had no ostensible affairs, and kept me by him, far from my due employment, and making a pretence of occupation. It is upon this passage I expect, and perhaps deserve, censure. I was not so dull but what I had my own thoughts. I could not see the master entrust himself into the hands of Harris, and not suspect some underhand contrivance. Harris bore a villainous reputation, and he had been tampered with in private by my lord. Mountain, the trader, proved upon inquiry to be another of the same kidney. The errand they were all gone upon, being the recovery of ill-gotten treasures, offered in itself a very strong incentive to foul play, and the character of the country where they journeyed promised impunity to deeds of blood. Well, it is true I had all these thoughts and fears, and guesses of the master's fate. But you are to consider I was the same man that sought to dash him from the bulwarks of a ship in the mid-sea, the same that, a little before, very impiously but sincerely offered God a bargain, seeking to hire God to be my bravo. It is true again that I had a good deal melted towards our enemy, but this I always thought of as a weakness of the flesh, and even culpable, my mind remaining steady and quite bent against him. True, yet again, that it was one thing to assume on my own shoulders the guilt and danger of a criminal attempt, and another to stand by and see my lord imperil and besmirch himself. But this was the very ground of my inaction, for, should I anyway stir in the business, I might fail indeed to save the master, but I could not miss to make a byword of my lord. Thus it was that I did nothing, and upon the same reasons I am still strong to justify my course. My lord had carried with him several introductions to chief people of the town and neighbourhood. Others he had before encountered in New York, with this consequence, that he went much abroad, and I am sorry to say was altogether too convivial in his habits. I was often in bed, but never asleep when he returned. And there was scarce a night when he did not betray the influence of liquor. By day he would still lay upon me endless tasks, which he showed considerable ingenuity to fish up and renew, in the manner of Penelope's web. I never refused, as I say, for I was hired to do his bidding. But I took no pains to keep my penetration under a bushel, and would sometimes smile in his face. "I think I must be the devil, and you Michael Scott," I said to him one day. "I have bridged Tweed and split the Eildons, and now you set me to the rope of sand." He looked at me with shining eyes, and looked away again, his jaw chewing, but without words. "Well, well, my lord," said I, "your will is my pleasure. I will do this thing for the 4th time. But I would beg of you to invent another task against to-morrow, for by my troth I am weary of this one." "You do not know what you are saying," returned my lord, putting on his hat and turning his back to me. "It is a strange thing you should take a pleasure to annoy me, a friend. But that is a different affair. It is a strange thing. I am a man that has had ill fortune all my life through. I am still surrounded by contrivances. I am always treading in plots," he burst out. "The whole world is banded against me." "I would not talk wicked nonsense if I were you," said I. "But I will tell you what I would do. I would put my head in cold water, for you had more last night than you could carry." "Do you think that?" said he, with a manner of interest highly awakened. "Would that be good for me? It's a thing I never tried." "I mind the days when you had no call to try, and I wish, my lord, that they were back again," said I. "But the plain truth is, if you continue to exceed, you will do yourself a mischief." "I don't appear to carry drink the way I used to," said my lord. "I get overtaken, Mackellar. But I will be more upon my guard." "That is what I would ask of you," I replied. "You are to bear in mind that you are Master Alexander's father. Give the bairn a chance to carry his name with some responsibility." "Ay, ay," said he. "You're a very sensible man, Mackellar, and have been long in my employ. But I think if you have nothing more to say to me, I will be stepping. If you have nothing more to say?" he added, with that burning, childish eagerness that was now so common with the man. "No, my lord, I have nothing more," said I, dryly enough. "Then I think I will be stepping," says my lord, and stood and looked at me, fidgeting with his hat, which he had taken off again. "I suppose you will have no errands?" "No. I am to meet Sir William Johnson, but I will be more upon my guard." He was silent for a time, and then, smiling, "Do you call to mind a place, Mackellar? It's a little below Eagles, where the burn runs very deep under a wood of rowans. I mind being there when I was a lad. Dear, it comes over me like an old song. I was after the fishing, and I made a bonny cast. But I was happy. I wonder, Mackellar, why I am never happy now." "My lord," said I, "if you would drink with more moderation, you would have the better chance. It is an old byword that the bottle is a false consoler." "No doubt," said he, "no doubt. Well, I think I will be going." "Good morning, my lord," said I. "Good morning," said he, and so got himself at last from the apartment. I give that for a fair specimen of my lord in the morning, and I must have described my patron very ill if the reader does not perceive a notable falling off. To behold the man thus fallen, to know him accepted among his companions for a poor muddled toper, welcome, if he were welcome at all, for the bare consideration of his title, and to recall the virtues he had once displayed against such odds of fortune, was not this a thing at once to rage and to be humbled at? In his cups he was more excessive. I will give but the one scene, close upon the end, which is strongly marked upon my memory to this day, and at the time affected me almost with horror. I was in bed, lying there awake, when I heard him stumbling on the stair and singing. My lord had no gift of music. His brother had all the graces of the family, so that, when I say singing, you are to understand a manner of high carolling utterance, which was truly neither speech nor song. Something not unlike is to be heard upon the lips of children ere they learn shame. On those of a man grown elderly it had a strange effect. He opened the door with noisy precaution, peered in, shading his candle, conceived me to slumber, entered, set his light upon the table, and took off his hat. I saw him very plain. A high, feverish exultation appeared to boil in his veins, and he stood and smiled and smirked upon the candle. Presently he lifted up his arm, snapped his fingers, and fell to undress. As he did so, having once more forgot my presence, he took back to his singing, and now I could hear the words, which were these from the old song of the Twa Corbies, endlessly repeated: "And over his banes when they are bare, the wind shall blaw for evermair." I have said that there was no music in the man. His strains had no logical succession, except in so far as they inclined a little to the minor mode, but they exercised a rude potency upon the feelings, and followed the words, and signified the feelings of the singer with barbaric fitness. He took it first in the time and manner of a rant. Presently this ill-favoured gleefulness abated. He began to dwell upon the notes more feelingly, and sank at last into a degree of maudlin pathos that was to me scarce bearable. By equal steps the original briskness of his acts declined, and when he was stripped to his breeches, he sat on the bedside and fell to whimpering. I know nothing less respectable than the tears of drunkenness, and turned my back impatiently on this poor sight. But he had started himself, I am to suppose, on that slippery descent of self-pity, on the which, to a man unstrung by old sorrows and recent potations, there is no arrest except exhaustion. His tears continued to flow, and the man to sit there 3 parts naked, in the cold air of the chamber. I twitted myself alternately with inhumanity and sentimental weakness, now half rising in my bed to interfere, now reading myself lessons of indifference and courting slumber, until, upon a sudden, the quantum mutatus ab illo shot into my mind, and calling to remembrance his old wisdom, constancy, and patience, I was overborne with a pity almost approaching the passionate, not for my master alone, but for the sons of man. At this I leaped from my place, went over to his side, and laid a hand on his bare shoulder, which was cold as stone. He uncovered his face, and showed it me all swollen and begrutton like a child's. Note: tear-marked. Return to text. And at the sight of my impatience, partially revived. "Think shame to yourself," said I. "This is bairnly conduct. I might have been snivelling myself if I had cared to swill my belly with wine. But I went to my bed sober like a man. Come, get into yours, and have done with this pitiable exhibition." "Oh, Mackellar," said he, "my heart is wae." "Wae?" cried I, "for a good cause, I think. What words were these you sang as you came in? Show pity to others. We then can talk of pity to yourself. You can be the one thing or the other, but I will be no party to half-way houses. If you're a striker, strike; and if you're a bleater, bleat." "Ay," cries he with a burst, "that's it. Strike! That's talking. Man, I've stood it all too long. But when they laid a hand upon the child, when the child's threatened," his momentary vigour whimpering off, "my child, my Alexander," and he was at his tears again. I took him by the shoulders and shook him. "Alexander," said I, "do you even think of him? Not you. Look yourself in the face like a brave man, and you'll find you're but a self-deceiver. The wife, the friend, the child, they're all equally forgot, and you sunk in a mere bog of selfishness." "Mackellar," said he, with a wonderful return to his old manner and appearance, "you may say what you will of me, but one thing I never was. I was never selfish." "I will open your eyes in your despite," said I. "How long have we been here? And how often have you written to your family? I think this is the first time you were ever separate. Have you written at all? Do they know if you are dead or living?" I had caught him here too openly. It braced his better nature. There was no more weeping. He thanked me very penitently, got to bed, and was soon fast asleep. And the first thing he did the next morning was to sit down and begin a letter to my lady. A very tender letter it was, too, though it was never finished. Indeed, all communication with New York was transacted by myself, and it will be judged I had a thankless task of it. What to tell my lady, and in what words, and how far to be false and how far cruel, was a thing that kept me often from my slumber. All this while, no doubt, my lord waited with growing impatiency for news of his accomplices. Harris, it is to be thought, had promised a high degree of expedition. The time was already overpast when word was to be looked for, and suspense was a very evil counsellor to a man of an impaired intelligence. My lord's mind throughout this interval dwelled almost wholly in the wilderness, following that party with whose deeds he had so much concern. He continually conjured up their camps and progresses, the fashion of the country, the perpetration in 1,000 different manners of the same horrid fact, and that consequent spectacle of the Master's bones lying scattered in the wind. These private guilty considerations I would continually observe, to peep forth in the man's talk, like rabbits from a hill. And it is the less wonder if the scene of his meditations began to draw him bodily. It is well known what pretext he took. Sir William Johnson had a diplomatic errand in these parts, and my lord and I, from curiosity, as was given out, went in his company. Sir William was well attended and liberally supplied. Hunters brought us venison, fish was taken for us daily in the streams, and brandy ran like water. We proceeded by day and encamped by night in the military style. Sentinels were set and changed. Every man had his named duty, and Sir William was the spring of all. There was much in this that might at times have entertained me, but for our misfortune the weather was extremely harsh. The days were in the beginning open, but the nights frosty from the first. A painful keen wind blew most of the time, so that we sat in the boat with blue fingers, and at night, as we scorched our faces at the fire, the clothes upon our backs appeared to be of paper. A dreadful solitude surrounded our steps. The land was quite dispeopled. There was no smoke of fires, and, save for a single boat of merchants on the second day, we met no travellers. The season was indeed late, but this desertion of the waterways impressed Sir William himself, and I have heard him more than once express a sense of intimidation. "I have come too late, I fear. They must have dug up the hatchet," he said, and the future proved how justly he had reasoned. I could never depict the blackness of my soul upon this journey. I have none of those minds that are in love with the unusual. To see the winter coming, and to lie in the field so far from any house, oppressed me like a nightmare. It seemed indeed a kind of awful braving of God's power, and this thought, which I dare say only writes me down a coward, was greatly exaggerated by my private knowledge of the errand we were come upon. I was besides encumbered by my duties to Sir William, whom it fell upon me to entertain, for my lord was quite sunk into a state bordering upon pervigilium, watching the woods with a rapt eye, sleeping scarce at all, and speaking sometimes not 20 words in a whole day. That which he said was still coherent, but it turned almost invariably upon the party for whom he kept his crazy lookout. He would tell Sir William often, and always as if it were a new communication, that he had a brother somewhere in the woods, and begged that the sentinel should be directed to inquire for him. "I am anxious for news of my brother," he would say, and sometimes, when we were under way, he would fancy he spied a canoe far off upon the water, or a camp on the shore, and exhibit painful agitation. It was impossible but Sir William should be struck with these singularities, and at last he led me aside and hinted his uneasiness. I touched my head and shook it, quite rejoiced to prepare a little testimony against possible disclosures. "But in that case," cries Sir William, "is it wise to let him go at large?" "Those that know him best," said I, "are persuaded that he should be humoured." "Well, well," replied Sir William, "it is none of my affairs. But if I had understood, you would never have been here." Our advance into this savage country had thus uneventfully proceeded for about a week, when we encamped for a night at a place where the river ran among considerable mountains clothed in wood. The fires were lighted on a level space at the water's edge, and we supped and lay down to sleep in the customary fashion. It chanced the night fell murderously cold. The stringency of the frost seized and bit me through my coverings, so that pain kept me wakeful, and I was afoot again before the peep of day, crouching by the fires or trotting to and fro at the stream's edge to combat the aching of my limbs. At last dawn began to break upon hoar woods and mountains, the sleepers rolled in their robes, and the boisterous river dashing among spears of ice. I stood looking about me, swaddled in my stiff coat of a bull's fur, and the breath smoking from my scorched nostrils, when, upon a sudden, a singular eager cry rang from the borders of the wood. The sentries answered it. The sleepers sprang to their feet. One pointed, the rest followed his direction with their eyes, and there, upon the edge of the forest and betwixt two trees, we beheld the figure of a man reaching forth his hands like one in ecstasy. The next moment he ran forward, fell on his knees at the side of the camp, and burst in tears. This was John Mountain, the trader, escaped from the most horrid perils, and his first word, when he got speech, was to ask if we had seen Secundra Das. "Seen what?" cries Sir William. "No," said I, "we have seen nothing of him. Why?" "Nothing?" says Mountain. "Then I was right after all." With that he struck his palm upon his brow. "But what takes him back?" he cried. "What takes the man back among dead bodies? There is some damned mystery here." This was a word which highly aroused our curiosity, but I shall be more perspicacious if I narrate these incidents in their true order. Here follows a narrative which I have compiled out of three sources, not very consistent in all points. First, a written statement by Mountain, in which everything criminal is cleverly smuggled out of view. Second, two conversations with Secundra Das, and third, many conversations with Mountain himself, in which he was pleased to be entirely plain, for the truth is he regarded me as an accomplice. Narrative of the trader Mountain. The crew that went up the river under the joint command of Captain Harris and the master numbered in all 9 persons, of whom, if I except Secundra Das, there was not one that had not merited the gallows. From Harris downward, the voyagers were notorious in that colony for desperate, bloody-minded miscreants. Some were reputed pirates, the most hawkers of rum, all ranters and drinkers, all fit associates, embarking together without remorse upon this treacherous and murderous design. I could not hear there was much discipline or any set captain in the gang, but Harris and 4 others, Mountain himself, 2 Scotsmen, Pinkerton and Hasty, and a man of the name of Hicks, a drunken shoemaker, put their heads together and agreed upon the course. In a material sense they were well provided, and the master in particular brought with him a tent, where he might enjoy some privacy and shelter. Even this small indulgence told against him in the minds of his companions, but indeed he was in a position so entirely false, and even ridiculous, that all his habit of command and arts of pleasing were here thrown away. In the eyes of all, except Secundra Das, he figured as a common gull and designated victim, going unconsciously to death. Yet he could not but suppose himself the contriver and the leader of the expedition. He could scarce help but so conduct himself, and at the least hint of authority or condescension, his deceivers would be laughing in their sleeves. I was so used to see and to conceive him in a high, authoritative attitude, that when I had conceived his position on this journey, I was pained and could have blushed. How soon he may have entertained a first surmise we cannot know, but it was long, and the party had advanced into the wilderness beyond the reach of any help, ere he was fully awakened to the truth. It fell thus. Harris and some others had drawn apart into the woods for consultation, when they were startled by a rustling in the brush. They were all accustomed to the arts of Indian warfare, and Mountain had not only lived and hunted, but fought and earned some reputation with the savages. He could move in the woods without noise, and follow a trail like a hound, and upon the emergence of this alert he was deputed by the rest to plunge into the thicket for intelligence. He was soon convinced there was a man in his close neighbourhood, moving with precaution but without art among the leaves and branches; and coming shortly to a place of advantage, he was able to observe Secundra Das crawling briskly off with many backward glances. At this he knew not whether to laugh or cry, and his accomplices, when he had returned and reported, were in much the same dubiety. There was now no danger of an Indian onslaught, but on the other hand, since Secundra Das was at the pains to spy upon them, it was highly probable he knew English, and if he knew English, it was certain the whole of their design was in the master's knowledge. There was one singularity in the position. If Secundra Das knew and concealed his knowledge of English, Harris was a proficient in several of the tongues of India, and as his career in that part of the world had been a great deal worse than profligate, he had not thought proper to remark upon the circumstance. Each side had thus a spy-hole on the counsels of the other. The plotters, so soon as this advantage was explained, returned to camp. Harris, hearing the Hindustani was once more closeted with his master, crept to the side of the tent, and the rest, sitting about the fire with their tobacco, awaited his report with impatience. When he came at last, his face was very black. He had overheard enough to confirm the worst of his suspicions. Secundra Das was a good English scholar. He had been some days creeping and listening. The master was now fully informed of the conspiracy, and the pair proposed on the morrow to fall out of line at a carrying place and plunge at a venture in the woods, preferring the full risk of famine, savage beasts, and savage men to their position in the midst of traitors. What then was to be done? Some were for killing the master on the spot, but Harris assured them that would be a crime without profit, since the secret of the treasure must die along with him that buried it. Others were for desisting at once from the whole enterprise and making for New York. But the appetizing name of treasure, and the thought of the long way they had already travelled, dissuaded the majority. I imagine they were dull fellows for the most part. Harris, indeed, had some acquirements. Mountain was no fool. Hastie was an educated man, but even these had manifestly failed in life, and the rest were the dregs of colonial rascality. The conclusion they reached, at least, was more the offspring of greed and hope than reason. It was to temporize, to be wary and watch the master, to be silent and supply no further aliment to his suspicions, and to depend entirely, as well as I make out, on the chance that their victim was as greedy, hopeful, and irrational as themselves, and might after all betray his life and treasure. Twice in the course of the next day Secundra and the master must have appeared to themselves to have escaped, and twice they were circumvented. The master, save that the second time he grew a little pale, displayed no sign of disappointment, apologized for the stupidity with which he had fallen aside, thanked his recapturers as for a service, and rejoined the caravan with all his usual gallantry and cheerfulness of mien and bearing. But it is certain he had smelled a rat, for from thenceforth he and Secundra spoke only in each other's ear, and Harris listened and shivered by the tent in vain. The same night it was announced they were to leave the boats and proceed by foot, a circumstance which, as it put an end to the confusion of the portages, greatly lessened the chances of escape. And now there began between the two sides a silent contest, for life on the one hand, for riches on the other. They were now near that quarter of the desert in which the master himself must begin to play the part of guide, and using this for a pretext of persecution, Harris and his men sat with him every night about the fire, and laboured to entrap him into some admission. If he let slip his secret, he knew well it was the warrant for his death. On the other hand, he durst not refuse their questions, and must appear to help them in the best of his capacity, or he practically published his mistrust. And yet Mountain assures me the man's brow was never ruffled. He sat in the midst of these jackals, his life depending by a thread, like some easy, witty householder at home by his own fire. An answer he had for everything, as often as not a jesting answer, avoided threats, evaded insults, talked, laughed, and listened with an open countenance, and, in short, conducted himself in such a manner as must have disarmed suspicion, and went near to stagger knowledge. Indeed, Mountain confessed to me they would soon have disbelieved the captain's story, and supposed the designated victim still quite innocent of the designs, but for the fact that he continued, however ingeniously, to give the slip to questions, and the yet stronger confirmation of his repeated efforts to escape. The last of these, which brought things to a head, I am now to relate. And first I should say that by this time the temper of Harris's companions was utterly worn out. Civility was scarce pretended, and for one very significant circumstance, the master and Secundra had been, on some pretext, deprived of weapons. On their side, however, the threatened pair kept up the parade of friendship handsomely. Secundra was all bows, the master all smiles, and on the last night of the truce he had even gone so far as to sing for the diversion of the company. It was observed that he had also eaten with unusual heartiness, and drank deep, doubtless from design. At least, about 3 in the morning, he came out of the tent into the open air, audibly mourning and complaining, with all the manner of a sufferer from surfeit. For some while Secundra publicly attended on his patron, who at last became more easy, and fell asleep on the frosty ground behind the tent, the Indian returning within. Some time after, the sentry was changed, had the master pointed out to him, where he lay in what is called a robe of buffalo, and thenceforth kept an eye upon him, he declared, without remission. With the first of the dawn, a draught of wind came suddenly, and blew open one side the corner of the robe, and with the same puff the master's hat whirled in the air, and fell some yards away. The sentry, thinking it remarkable the sleeper should not awaken, thereupon drew near, and the next moment, with a great shout, informed the camp their prisoner was escaped. He had left behind his Indian, who, in the first vivacity of the surprise, came near to pay the forfeit of his life, and was in fact inhumanly mishandled. But Secundra, in the midst of threats and cruelties, stuck to it with extraordinary loyalty that he was quite ignorant of his master's plans, which might indeed be true, and of the manner of his escape, which was demonstrably false. Nothing was therefore left to the conspirators but to rely entirely on the skill of Mountain. The night had been frosty, the ground quite hard, and the sun was no sooner up than a strong thaw set in. It was Mountain's boast that few men could have followed that trail, and still fewer, even of the native Indians, found it. The master had thus a long start before his pursuers had the scent, and he must have travelled with surprising energy for a pedestrian so unused, since it was near noon before Mountain had a view of him. At this conjuncture the trader was alone, all his companions following, at his own request, several hundred yards in the rear. He knew the master was unarmed. His heart was besides heated with the exercise and lust of hunting, and seeing the quarry so close, so defenceless, and seeming so fatigued, he vaingloriously determined to effect the capture with his single hand. A step or two farther brought him to one margin of a little clearing. On the other, with his arms folded, and his back to a huge stone, the master sat. It is possible Mountain may have made a rustle. It is certain, at least, the master raised his head, and gazed directly at that quarter of the thicket where his hunter lay. "I could not be sure he saw me," Mountain said. "He just looked my way like a man with his mind made up. And all the courage ran out of me like rum out of a bottle." And presently, when the master looked away again, and appeared to resume those meditations in which he had sat immersed before the trader's coming, Mountain slunk stealthily back, and returned to seek the help of his companions. And now began the chapter of surprises. For the scout had scarce informed the others of his discovery, and they were yet preparing their weapons for a rush upon the fugitive, when the man himself appeared in their midst, walking openly and quietly with his hands behind his back. "Ah, men," says he, on his beholding them, "here is a fortunate encounter. Let us get back to camp." Mountain had not mentioned his own weakness or the master's disconcerting gaze upon the thicket, so that, with all the rest, his return appeared spontaneous. For all that, a hubbub arose. Oaths flew, fists were shaken, and guns pointed. "Let us get back to camp," said the master. "I have an explanation to make, but it must be laid before you all. And in the meanwhile I would put up these weapons, one of which might very easily go off and blow away your hopes of treasure." "I would not kill," says he, smiling, "the goose with the golden eggs." The charm of his superiority once more triumphed, and the party, in no particular order, set off on their return. By the way, he found occasion to get a word or two apart with Mountain. "You are a clever fellow and a bold," says he, "but I am not so sure that you are doing yourself justice. I would have you to consider whether you would not do better, ay, and safer, to serve me instead of serving so commonplace a rascal as Mr. Harris. Consider of it," he concluded, dealing the man a gentle tap upon the shoulder, "and don't be in haste. Dead or alive, you will find me an ill man to quarrel with." When they were come back to the camp, where Harris and Pinkerton stood guard over Secundra, these two ran upon the master like viragos, and were amazed out of measure when they were bidden by their comrades to stand back and hear what the gentleman had to say. The master had not flinched before their onslaught, nor at this proof of the ground he had gained did he betray the least sufficiency. "Do not let us be in haste," says he. "Meat first, and public speaking after." With that they made a hasty meal, and as soon as it was done, the master, leaning on one elbow, began his speech. He spoke long, addressing himself to each except Harris, finding for each, with the same exception, some particular flattery. He called them bold, honest blades, declared he had never seen a more jovial company, work better done, or pains more merrily supported. "Well then," says he, "some one asks me why the devil I ran away. But that is scarce worth answer, for I think you all know pretty well. But you know only pretty well. That is a point I shall arrive at presently, and be you ready to remark it when it comes. There is a traitor here, a double traitor. I will give you his name before I am done, and let that suffice for now. But here comes some other gentleman, and asks me, why in the devil I came back? Well, before I answer that question, I have one to put to you. It was this cur here, this Harris, that speaks Hindustani?" cries he, rising on one knee and pointing fair at the man's face, with a gesture indescribably menacing. And when he had been answered in the affirmative, "Ah," says he, "then are all my suspicions verified, and I did rightly to come back. Now, men, hear the truth for the first time." Thereupon he launched forth in a long story, told with extraordinary skill, how he had all along suspected Harris, how he had found the confirmation of his fears, and how Harris must have misrepresented what passed between Secundra and himself. At this point he made a bold stroke with excellent effect. "I suppose," says he, "you think you are going shares with Harris. I suppose you think you will see to that yourselves. You would naturally not think so flat a rogue could cozen you. But have a care. These half-idiots have a sort of cunning, as the skunk has its stench, and it may be news to you that Harris has taken care of himself already. Yes, for him the treasure is all money in the bargain. You must find it or go starve, but he has been paid beforehand. My brother paid him to destroy me. Look at him if you doubt. Look at him, grinning and gulping, a detected thief." Thence, having made this happy impression, he explained how he had escaped, and thought better of it, and at last concluded to come back, lay the truth before the company, and take his chance with them once more, persuaded as he was they would instantly depose Harris and elect some other leader. "There is the whole truth," said he, "and, with one exception, I put myself entirely in your hands." "What is the exception?" "There he sits," he cried, pointing once more to Harris, "a man that has to die. Weapons and conditions are all one to me. Put me face to face with him, and if you give me nothing but a stick, In 5 minutes I will show you a sop of broken carrion, fit for dogs to roll in." It was dark night when he made an end. They had listened in almost perfect silence, but the firelight scarce permitted any one to judge from the look of his neighbours with what result of persuasion or conviction. Indeed, the master had set himself in the brightest place, and kept his face there to be the centre of men's eyes, doubtless on a profound calculation. Silence followed for a while, and presently the whole party became involved in disputation. The master, lying on his back with his hands knit under his head, and one knee flung across the other, like a person unconcerned in the result. And here I dare say his bravado carried him too far and prejudiced his case. At least, after a cast or two back and forward, opinion settled finally against him. It's possible he hoped to repeat the business of the pirate ship, and be himself, perhaps on hard enough conditions, elected leader. And things went so far that way that Mountain actually threw out the proposition. But the rock he split upon was Hasty. This fellow was not well liked, being sour and slow, with an ugly, glowering disposition. But he had studied some time for the church at Edinburgh College, before ill conduct had destroyed his prospects, and he now remembered and applied what he had learned. Indeed, he had not proceeded very far when the master rolled carelessly upon one side, which was done, in Mountain's opinion, to conceal the beginnings of despair upon his countenance. Hasty dismissed the most of what they had heard as nothing to the matter. What they wanted was the treasure. All that was said of Harris might be true, and they would have to see to that in time. But what had that to do with the treasure? They had heard a vast of words, but the truth was just this, that Mr. Dury was damnably frightened and had several times run off. Here he was, whether caught or come back was all one to Hasty. The point was to make an end of the business. As for the talk of deposing and electing captains, he hoped they were all free men and could attend their own affairs. That was dust flung in their eyes, and so was the proposal to fight Harris. "He shall fight no one in this camp, I can tell him that," said Hasty. "We had trouble enough to get his arms away from him, and we should look pretty fools to give them back again. But if it's excitement the gentleman is after, I can supply him with more than perhaps he cares about. For I have no intention to spend the remainder of my life in these mountains. Already I have been too long, and I propose that he should immediately tell us where that treasure is, or else immediately be shot. And there," says he, producing his weapon, "there is the pistol that I mean to use." "Come, I call you a man," cries the master, sitting up and looking at the speaker with an air of admiration. "I didn't ask you to call me anything," returned Hasty. "Which is it to be?" "That's an idle question," said the master. "Needs must when the devil drives. The truth is, we are within easy walk of the place, and I will show it you to-morrow." With that, as if all were quite settled, and settled exactly to his mind, he walked off to his tent, whither Secundra had preceded him. I cannot think of these last turns and wriggles of my old enemy except with admiration. Scarce even pity is mingled with the sentiment, so strongly the man supported, so boldly resisted his misfortunes. Even at that hour, when he perceived himself quite lost, when he saw he had but effected an exchange of enemies, and overthrown Harris to set Hasty up, no sign of weakness appeared in his behaviour, and he withdrew to his tent, already determined, I must suppose, upon affronting the incredible hazard of his last expedient with the same easy, assured, genteel expression and demeanour as he might have left a theatre with all to join a supper of the wits. But doubtless within, if we could see there, his soul trembled. Early in the night word went about the camp that he was sick, and the first thing the next morning he called Hasty to his side, and inquired most anxiously if he had any skill in medicine. As a matter of fact, this was a vanity of that fallen divinity student's, to which he had cunningly addressed himself. Hasty examined him, and, being flattered, ignorant, and highly suspicious, knew not in the least whether the man was sick or malingering. In this state he went forth again to his companions, and, as the thing which would give himself most consequence either way, announced that the patient was in a fair way to die. For all that, he added with an oath, and if he bursts by the wayside, he must bring us this morning to the treasure. But there were several in the camp, Mountain among the number, whom this brutality revolted. They would have seen the master pistoled, or pistoled him themselves, without the smallest sentiment of pity, but they seemed to have been touched by his gallant fight and unequivocal defeat the night before. Perhaps, too, they were even already beginning to oppose themselves to their new leader. At least, they now declared that if the man was sick, he should have a day's rest in spite of Hasty's teeth. The next morning he was manifestly worse, and Hasty himself began to display something of humane concern. So easily does even the pretence of doctoring awaken sympathy. The third, the master called Mountain and Hasty to the tent, announced himself to be dying, gave them full particulars as to the position of the cache, and begged them to set out incontinently on the quest, so that they might see if he deceived them, and, if they were at first unsuccessful, he should be able to correct their error. But here arose a difficulty on which he doubtless counted. None of these men would trust another. None would consent to stay behind. On the other hand, although the master seemed extremely low, spoke scarce above a whisper, and lay much of the time insensible, it was still possible it was a fraudulent sickness, and if all went treasure-hunting, it might prove they had gone upon a wild-goose chase, and returned to find their prisoner flown. They concluded, therefore, to hang idling round the camp, alleging sympathy to their reason, and certainly, so mingled are our dispositions, several were sincerely, if not very deeply, affected by the natural peril of the man whom they callously designed to murder. In the afternoon, Hasty was called to the bedside to pray, the which, incredible as it must appear, he did with unction. About 8 at night the wailing of Secundra announced that all was over, and before 10 the Indian, with the link stuck in the ground, was toiling at the grave. Sunrise of the next day beheld the master's burial, all hands attending with great decency of demeanour, and the body was laid in the earth, wrapped in a fur robe, with only the face uncovered, which last was of a waxy whiteness, and had the nostrils plugged according to some oriental habit of Secundra's. No sooner was the grave filled than the lamentations of the Indian once more struck concern to every heart. And it appears this gang of murderers, so far from resenting his outcries, although both distressful and, in such a country, perilous to their own safety, roughly but kindly endeavoured to console him. But if human nature is even in the worst of men occasionally kind, it is still, and before all things, greedy, and they soon turned from the mourner to their own concerns. The cache of the treasure being hard by, although yet unidentified, it was concluded not to break camp, and the day passed, on the part of the voyagers, in unavailing exploration of the woods, Secundra the while lying on his master's grave. That night they placed no sentinel, but lay altogether about the fire in the customary woodman fashion, the heads outward like the spokes of a wheel. Morning found them in the same disposition. Only Pinkerton, who lay on Mountain's right, between him and Hasty, had, in the hours of darkness, been secretly butchered, and there lay, still wrapped as to his body in his mantle, but offering above that ungodly and horrific spectacle of the scalped head. The gang were that morning as pale as a company of phantoms, for the pertinacity of Indian war, or, to speak more correctly, Indian murder, was well known to all. But they laid the chief blame on their unsentinelled posture, and, fired with the neighbourhood of the treasure, determined to continue where they were. Pinkerton was buried hard by the master. The survivors again passed the day in exploration, and returned in a mingled humour of anxiety and hope, being partly certain they were now close on the discovery of what they sought, and, on the other hand, with the return of darkness, infected with the fear of Indians. Mountain was the first sentry. He declares he neither slept nor yet sat down, but kept his watch with a perpetual and straining vigilance, and it was even with unconcern that, when he saw by the stars his time was up, he drew near the fire to awaken his successor. This man, it was Hicks the shoemaker, slept on the lee side of the circle, something farther off in consequence than those to windward, and in a place darkened by the blowing smoke. Mountain stooped and took him by the shoulder. His hand was at once smeared by some adhesive wetness, and the wind at the moment veering, the firelight shone upon the sleeper, and showed him, like Pinkerton, dead and scalped. It was clear they had fallen in the hands of one of those matchless Indian bravos that will sometimes follow a party for days, and in spite of indefatigable travel and unsleeping watch, continue to keep up with their advance, and steal a scalp at every resting place. Upon this discovery, the treasure-seekers, already reduced to a poor half-dozen, fell into mere dismay, seized a few necessaries, and, deserting the remainder of their goods, fled outright into the forest. Their fire they left still burning, and their dead comrade unburied. All day they ceased not to flee, eating by the way from hand to mouth, and, since they feared to sleep, continued to advance at random even in the hours of darkness. But the limit of man's endurance is soon reached. When they rested at last, it was to sleep profoundly, and when they woke, it was to find that the enemy was still upon their heels, and death and mutilation had once more lessened and deformed their company. By this they had become light-headed. They had quite missed their path in the wilderness. Their stores were already running low. With the further horrors, it is superfluous that I should swell this narrative, already too prolonged. Suffice it to say that, when at length the night passed by innocuous, and they might breathe again in the hope that the murderer had at last desisted from pursuit, Mountain and Secundra were alone. The trader is firmly persuaded their unseen enemy was some warrior of his own acquaintance, and that he himself was spared by favour. The mercy extended to Secundra he explains on the ground that the East Indian was thought to be insane, partly from the fact that, through all the horrors of the flight, and while others were casting away their very food and weapons, Secundra continued to stagger forward with a mattock on his shoulder, and partly because in the last days, and with a degree of heat and fluency, he perpetually spoke with himself in his own language. But he was sane enough when it came to English. "You think he will be gone quite a way?" he asked, upon their blessed awakening in safety. "I pray God so. I believe so. I dare to believe so," Mountain had replied, almost with incoherence, as he described the scene to me. And indeed he was so much distempered that until he met us the next morning, he could scarce be certain whether he had dreamed, or whether it was a fact that Secundra had thereupon turned directly about, and returned without a word upon their footprints, setting his face for those wintry and hungry solitudes, along a path whose every stage was milestoned with a mutilated corpse. End of chapter 11. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Chapter 12 of The Master of Ballantrae by Robert Louis Stevenson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Chapter 12. The Journey in the Wilderness, continued. Mountain's story, as it was laid before Sir William Johnson and my lord, was shorn, of course, of all the earlier particulars, and the expedition described to have proceeded uneventfully until the Master sickened. But the latter part was very forcibly related, the speaker visibly thrilling to his recollections, and our then situation on the fringe of the same desert, and the private interests of each, gave him an audience prepared to share in his emotions. For Mountain's intelligence not only changed the world for my Lord Durrisdeer, but materially affected the designs of Sir William Johnson. These I find I must lay more at length before the reader. Word had reached Albany of dubious import. It had been rumoured that some hostility was to be put in act, and the Indian diplomatist had thereupon sped into the wilderness, even at the approach of winter, to nip that mischief in the bud. Here, on the borders, he learned that he was come too late, and the difficult choice was thus presented to a man, upon the whole, not any more bold than prudent. His standing with the painted braves may be compared to that of my Lord President Culloden among the chiefs of our own Highlanders at the 45. That is as much as to say, he was to these men reason's only speaking trumpet, and counsels of peace and moderation, if they were to prevail at all, must prevail singly through his influence. If then he should return, the province must lie open to all the abominable tragedies of Indian war. The houses blaze, the wayfarer be cut off, and the men of the woods collect their usual disgusting spoil of human scalps. On the other side, to go farther forth, to risk so small a party deeper in the desert, to carry words of peace among warlike savages already rejoicing to return to war, here was an extremity from which it was easy to perceive his mind revolted. "I have come too late," he said more than once, and would fall into a deep consideration, his head bowed in his hands, his foot patting the ground. At length he raised his face and looked upon us, that is to say, upon my lord, Mountain, and myself, sitting close round a small fire, which had been made for privacy in one corner of the camp. "My lord, to be quite frank with you, I find myself in two minds," said he. "I think it very needful I should go on, but not at all proper I should any longer enjoy the pleasure of your company. We are here still upon the water side, and I think the risk to southward no great matter. Will not yourself and Mr. Mackellar take a single boat's crew and return to Albany?" My lord, I should say, had listened to Mountain's narrative, regarding him throughout with a painful intensity of gaze, and since the tale concluded, had sat as in a dream. There was something very daunting in his look, something, to my eyes, not rightly human; the face lean and dark and aged, the mouth painful, the teeth disclosed in a perpetual rictus, the eyeball swimming clear of the lids upon a field of bloodshot white. I could not behold him myself without a jarring irritation, such as I believe is too frequently the uppermost feeling on the sickness of those dear to us. Others, I could not but remark, were scarce able to support his neighbourhood. Sir William eviting to be near him, Mountain dodging his eye, and when he met it, blenching and halting in his story. At this appeal, however, my lord appeared to recover his command upon himself. "To Albany," said he, with a good voice. "Not short of it, at least," replied Sir William. "There is no safety nearer hand." "I should be very sweer to return," says my lord. Note: unwilling. Return to text. "I am not afraid of Indians," he added, with a jerk. "I wish that I could say so much," returned Sir William, smiling, "although if any man durst say it, it should be myself. But you are to keep in view my responsibility, and that, as the voyage has now become highly dangerous, and your business, if ever you had any," says he, "brought quite to a conclusion by the distressing family intelligence you have received, I should be hardly justified if I even suffered you to proceed, and run the risk of some obloquy if something regrettable should follow." My lord turned to Mountain. "What did he pretend he died of?" he asked. "I don't think I understand, your honour," said the trader, pausing, like a man very much affected, in the dressing of some cruel frostbites. For a moment my lord seemed at a full stop, and then, with some irritation, "I ask you what he died of. Surely that's a plain question," said he. "Oh, I don't know," said Mountain. "Hastie even never knew. He seemed to sicken natural and just pass away." "There it is, you see," concluded my lord, turning to Sir William. "Your lordship is too deep for me," replied Sir William. "Why," says my lord, "this is a matter of succession. My son's title may be called in doubt, and the man being supposed to be dead of nobody can tell what, a great deal of suspicion would naturally be roused." "But, God damn me, the man's buried!" cried Sir William. "I will never believe that," returned my lord, painfully trembling. "I'll never believe it," he cried again, and jumped to his feet. "Did he look dead?" he asked of Mountain. "Look dead?" repeated the trader. "He looked white. Why, what would he be at, I tell you? I put the sods upon him." My lord caught Sir William by the coat with a hooked hand. "This man has the name of my brother," says he, "but it's well understood he was never canny." "Can he?" says Sir William. "What is that?"
"He's not of this world," whispered my lord, "neither him nor the black deal that serves him. I have struck my sword through his vitals," he cried. "I have felt the hilt dirl on his breastbone."
Note, ring, return to text.
"And the hot blood spurt in my very face, time and again. Time and again," he repeated, with a gesture indescribable.
"But he was never dead for that," said he, and sighed aloud. "Why should I think he was dead now?"
"No, not till I see him rotting," says he.
Sir William looked across at me with a long face. Mountain forgot his wound, staring and gaping. "My lord," said I wish you would collect your spirits." But my throat was so dry, and my own wits so scattered, I could add no more.
"No," says my lord, "it's not to be supposed that he would understand me. Mackellar does, for he kens all, and has seen him buried before now. This is a very good servant to me, Sir William, this man Mackellar. He buried him with his own hands, he and my father, by the light of 2 siller candlesticks. The other man is a familiar spirit. He brought him from Coromandel. I would have told you this long syne, Sir William, only it was in the family." These last remarks he made with a kind of melancholy composure, and his time of aberration seemed to pass away. "You can ask yourself what it all means," he proceeded. "My brother falls sick and dies and is buried, or so they say, and all seems very plain. But why did the familiar go back? I think ye must see for yourself it's a point that wants some clearing." "I will be at your service, my lord, in half a minute," said Sir William, rising. "Mr. Mackellar, 2 words from you." And he led me without the camp, the frost crunching in our steps, the trees standing at our elbow, hoar with frost, even as on that night in the long shrubbery. "Of course this is midsummer madness," said Sir William, as soon as we were gotten out of hearing. "Why, certainly," said I. "The man is mad. I think that manifest." "Shall I seize and bind him?" asked Sir William. "I will, upon your authority. If these are all ravings, that should certainly be done." I looked down upon the ground, back at the camp with its bright fires and the folk watching us, and about me on the woods and mountains. There was just the one way that I could not look, and that was in Sir William's face. "Sir William," said I at last, "I think my lord not sane, and have long thought him so. But there are degrees in madness, and whether he should be brought under restraint— Sir William, I am no fit judge," I concluded. "I will be the judge," said he. "I asked for facts. Was there in all that jargon any word of truth or sanity? Do you hesitate?" he asked. "Am I to understand you have buried this gentleman before?" "Not buried," said I; and then, taking up courage at last, "Sir William," said I, "unless I were to tell you a long story which much concerns a noble family, and myself not in the least, it would be impossible to make this matter clear to you. Say the word, and I will do it, right or wrong. And at any rate, I will say so much, that my lord is not so crazy as he seems. This is a strange matter, into the tale of which you are unhappily drifted." "I desire none of your secrets," replied Sir William, "but I will be plain, at the risk of incivility, and confess that I take little pleasure in my present company." "I would be the last to blame you," said I, "for that." "I have not asked either for your censure or your praise, sir," returned Sir William. "I desire simply to be quit of you, and to that effect I put a boat and complement of men at your disposal." "This is fairly offered," said I, after reflection, "but you must suffer me to say a word upon the other side. We have a natural curiosity to learn the truth of this affair. I have some of it myself. My lord, it is very plain, has but too much. The matter of the Indian's return is enigmatical." "I think so myself," Sir William interrupted, "and I propose, since I go in that direction, to probe it to the bottom. Whether or not the man has gone like a dog to lie upon his master's grave, his life at least is in great danger, and I propose, if I can, to save it. There is nothing against his character?" "Nothing, Sir William," I replied. "And the other," he said, "I have heard my lord, of course, but from the circumstances of his servant's loyalty, I must suppose he had some noble qualities." "You must not ask me that," I cried. "Hell may have noble flames. I have known him a score of years, and always hated and always admired, and always slavishly feared him." "I appear to intrude again upon your secrets," said Sir William. "Believe me, inadvertently enough that I will see the grave, and, if possible, rescue the Indian. Upon these terms, can you persuade your master to return to Albany?" "Sir William," said I will tell you how it is. You do not see my lord to advantage. It will seem even strange to you that I should love him; but I do, and I am not alone. If he goes back to Albany, it must be by force, and it will be the death warrant of his reason, and perhaps his life. That is my sincere belief. But I am in your hands, and ready to obey, if you will assume so much responsibility as to command." "I will have no shred of responsibility. It is my single endeavour to avoid the same," cried Sir William. "You insist upon following this journey up, and be it so. I wash my hands of the whole matter." With which word he turned upon his heel and gave the order to break camp; and my lord, who had been hovering near by, came instantly to my side. "Which is it to be?" said he. "You are to have your way," I answered. "You shall see the grave." The situation of the Master's grave was, between guides, easily described. It lay, indeed, beside a chief landmark of the wilderness, a certain range of peaks, conspicuous by their design and altitude, and the source of many brawling tributaries to that inland sea, Lake Champlain. It was therefore possible to strike for it direct, instead of following back the blood-stained trail of the fugitives, and to cover in some 16 hours of march a distance which their perturbed wanderings had extended over more than 60. Our boats we left under our guard upon the river. It was indeed probable we should return to find them frozen fast; and the small equipment with which we set forth upon the expedition included not only an infinity of furs to protect us from the cold, but an arsenal of snowshoes to render travel possible when the inevitable snow should fall. Considerable alarm was manifested at our departure. The march was conducted with soldierly precaution, the camp at night sedulously chosen and patrolled; and it was a consideration of this sort that arrested us the second day within not many hundred yards of our destination, the night being already imminent, the spot in which we stood well qualified to be a strong camp for a party of our numbers, and Sir William therefore, on a sudden thought, arresting our advance. Before us was the high range of mountains toward which we had been all day deviously drawing near. From the first light of the dawn their silver peaks had been the goal of our advance across a tumbled lowland forest, thrid with rough streams and strewn with monstrous boulders; the peaks, as I say, silver, for already at the higher altitudes the snow fell nightly; but the woods and the low ground only breathed upon with frost. All day heaven had been charged with ugly vapours, in the which the sun swam and glimmered like a shilling piece. All day the wind blew on our left cheek, barbarous cold, but very pure to breathe. With the end of the afternoon, however, the wind fell; the clouds, being no longer reinforced, were scattered or drunk up; the sun set behind us with some wintry splendour, and the white brow of the mountains shared its dying glow. It was dark ere we had supper. We ate in silence, and the meal was scarce dispatched before my lord slunk from the fireside to the margin of the camp, whither I made haste to follow him. The camp was on high ground, overlooking a frozen lake, perhaps a mile in its longest measurement. All about us the forest lay in heights and hollows; above rose the white mountains, and higher yet the moon rode in a fair sky. There was no breath of air; nowhere a twig creaked, and the sounds of our own camp were hushed and swallowed up in the surrounding stillness. Now that the sun and the wind were both gone down, it appeared almost warm, like a night of July, a singular illusion of the sense when earth, air, and water were strained to bursting with the extremity of frost. My lord, or what I still continued to call by his loved name, stood with his elbow on one hand and his chin sunk in the other, gazing before him on the surface of the wood. My eyes followed his and rested almost pleasantly upon the frosted contexture of the pines rising in moonlit hillocks, or sinking in the shadow of small glens. Hard by, I told myself, was the grave of our enemy, now gone where the wicked cease from troubling, the earth heaped for ever on his once so active limbs. I could not but think of him as somehow fortunate to be thus done with man's anxiety and weariness, the daily expense of spirit, and that daily river of circumstance to be swum through at any hazard under the penalty of shame or death. I could not but think how good was the end of that long travel, and with that my mind swung at a tangent to my lord. For was not my lord dead also? A maimed soldier looking vainly for discharge, lingering derided in the line of battle. A kind man, I remembered him, wise, with a decent pride, a son perhaps too dutiful, a husband only too loving, one that could suffer and be silent, one whose hand I loved to press. Of a sudden pity caught in my windpipe with a sob. I could have wept aloud to remember and behold him; and standing thus by his elbow under the broad moon, I prayed fervently either that he should be released, or I strengthened to persist in my affection. "O God," said I, "this was the best man to me and to himself, and now I shrink from him. He did no wrong, or not till he was broke with sorrows. These are but his honourable wounds that we begin to shrink from. O cover them up! O take him away before we hate him!" I was still so engaged in my own bosom, when a sound broke suddenly upon the night. It was neither very loud nor very near; yet, bursting as it did from so profound and so prolonged a silence, it startled the camp like an alarm of trumpets. Ere I had taken breath, Sir William was beside me, the main part of the voyagers clustered at his back, intently giving ear. Methought, as I glanced at them across my shoulder, there was a whiteness other than moonlight on their cheeks, and the rays of the moon reflected with a sparkle on the eyes of some, and the shadows lying black under the brows of others, according as they raised or bowed their head to listen, gave to the group a strange air of animation and anxiety. My lord was to the front, crouching a little forth, his hand raised as for silence, a man turned to stone; and still the sounds continued, breathlessly renewed, with a precipitate rhythm. Suddenly Mountain spoke, in a loud broken whisper, as of a man relieved. "I have it now," he said; and, as we all turned to hear him, "The Indian must have known the cache," he added. "That is he. He is digging out the treasure." "Why, to be sure," exclaimed Sir William, "we were geese not to have supposed so much." "The only thing is," Mountain resumed, "the sound is very close to our old camp. And again, I do not see how he is there before us, unless the man had wings." "Greed and fear are wings," remarked Sir William. "But this rogue has given us an alert, and I have a notion to return the compliment. What say you, gentlemen? Shall we have a moonlight hunt?" It was so agreed. Dispositions were made to surround Secundra at his task. Some of Sir William's Indians hastened in advance, and, a strong guard being left at our headquarters, we set forth along the uneven bottom of the forest, frost crackling, ice sometimes loudly splitting underfoot, and overhead the blackness of pine woods and the broken brightness of the moon. Our way led down into a hollow of the land, and as we descended the sounds diminished, and it almost died away. Upon the other slope it was more open, only dotted with a few pines, and several vast and scattered rocks that made inky shadows in the moonlight. Here the sounds began to reach us more distinctly. We could now perceive the ring of iron, and more exactly estimate the furious degree of haste with which the digger plied his instrument. As we neared the top of the ascent, a bird or two winged aloft and hovered darkly in the moonlight, and the next moment we were gazing through a fringe of trees upon a singular picture. A narrow plateau, overlooked by the white mountains and encompassed nearer hand by woods, lay bare to the strong radiance of the moon.
Rough goods, such as make the wealth of foresters, were sprinkled here and there upon the ground in meaningless disarray. About the midst a tent stood, silvered with frost, the door open, gaping on the black interior. At the one end of this small stage lay what seemed the tattered remnants of a man. Without doubt we had arrived upon the scene of Harris's encampment. There were the goods scattered in the panic of flight. It was in yon tent the Master breathed his last, and the frozen carrion that lay before us was the body of the drunken shoemaker. It was always moving to come upon the theatre of any tragic incident. To come upon it after so many days, and to find it in the seclusion of a desert still unchanged, must have impressed the mind of the most careless. And yet it was not that which struck us into pillars of stone, but the sight, which yet we had been half expecting, of Secundra, angled deep in the grave of his late master. He had cast the main part of his raiment by, yet his frail arms and shoulders glistered in the moonlight with a copious sweat. His face was contracted with anxiety and expectation. His blows resounded on the grave, as thick as sobs, and behind him, strangely deformed and ink-black upon the frosty ground, the creature's shadow repeated and parodied his swift gesticulations. Some night birds arose from the boughs upon our coming, and then settled back; but Secundra, absorbed in his toil, heard or heeded not at all. I heard Mountain whisper to Sir William, "Good God, it's the grave! He's digging him up!" It was what we had all guessed, and yet to hear it put in language thrilled me. Sir William violently started. "You damned sacrilegious hound!" he cried. "What's this?" Secundra leaped in the air. A little breathless cry escaped him. The tool flew from his grasp, and he stood one instant staring at the speaker. The next, swift as an arrow, he sped for the woods upon the farther side, and the next again, throwing up his hands with a violent gesture of resolution, he had begun already to retrace his steps. "Well, then, you come, you help," he was saying. But by now my lord had stepped beside Sir William. The moon shone fair upon his face, and the words were still upon Secundra's lips when he beheld and recognised his master's enemy. "Him!" he screamed, clasping his hands and shrinking on himself. "Come, come," said Sir William, "there is none here to do you harm, if you be innocent. And if you be guilty, your escape is quite cut off. Speak, what do you here among the graves of the dead and the remains of the unburied?" "You no murderer?" inquired Secundra. "You true man? You see me safe?" "I will see you safe, if you be innocent," returned Sir William. "I have said the thing, and I see not wherefore you should doubt it." "These all murderers," cried Secundra. "That is why he kill. Murderer!" pointing to Mountain. "These two higher murderers," pointing to my lord and myself. "All gallows murderers. Ah, I see you all swing in a rope. Now I go save the Sahib. He see you swing in a rope. The Sahib," he continued, pointing to the grave, "he not dead. He bury. He not dead." My lord uttered a little noise, moved nearer to the grave, and stood and stared in it. "Buried and not dead?" exclaimed Sir William. "What kind of rant is this?" "See, Sahib," said Secundra, "the Sahib and I alone with murderers. Try all way to escape, no way good. Then try this way. Good way in warm climate, good way in India. Here in this damn cold place, who can tell? I tell you, pretty good hurry. You help, you light a fire. Help rub." "What is the creature talking of?" cried Sir William. "My head goes round." "I tell you I bury him alive," said Secundra. "I teach him swallow his tongue. Now dig him up, pretty good hurry, and he not much worse. You light a fire." Sir William turned to the nearest of his men. "Light a fire," said he. "My lot seems to be cast with the insane." "You good man," returned Secundra. "Now I go dig the Sahib up." He returned as he spoke to the grave, and resumed his former toil. My lord stood rooted, and I at my lord's side, fearing I knew not what. The frost was not yet very deep, and presently the Indian threw aside his tool and began to scoop the dirt by handfuls. Then he disengaged a corner of a buffalo robe,
and then I saw Heir catch among his fingers. Yet a moment more, and the moon shone on something white. Awhile Secundra crouched upon his knees, scraping with delicate fingers, breathing with puffed lips; and when he moved aside, I beheld the face of the Master, wholly disengaged. It was deadly white, the eyes closed, the ears and nostrils plugged, the cheeks fallen, the nose sharp as if in death. But for all that he had lain so many days under the sod, corruption had not approached him; and, what strangely affected all of us, his lips and chin were mantled with a swarthy beard. "My God!" cried Mountain, "he was as smooth as a baby when we laid him there." "They say hair grows upon the dead," observed Sir William, but his voice was thick and weak. Secundra paid no heed to our remarks, digging swift as a terrier in the loose earth. Every moment the form of the Master, swathed in his buffalo robe, grew more distinct in the bottom of that shallow trough, the moon shining strong, and the shadows of the standers by, as they drew forward and back, falling and flitting over his emergent countenance. The sight held us with a horror not before experienced. I dared not look my lord in the face, but for as long as it lasted I never observed him to draw breath; and a little in the background one of the men, I know not whom, burst into a kind of sobbing. "Now," said Secundra, "you help me lift him out." Of the flight of time I have no idea. It may have been 3 hours, and it may have been 5, that the Indian laboured to reanimate his master's body. One thing only I know, that it was still night, and the moon was not yet set, although it had sunk low, and now barred the plateau with long shadows, when Secundra uttered a small cry of satisfaction, and, leaning swiftly forth, I thought I could myself perceive a change upon that icy countenance of the unburied. The next moment I beheld his eyelids flutter; the next they rose entirely, and the weak old corpse looked me for a moment in the face. So much display of life I can myself swear to. I have heard from others that he visibly strove to speak, that his teeth showed in his beard, and that his brow was contorted as with an agony of pain and effort. And this may have been, I know not. I was otherwise engaged; for at that first disclosure of the dead man's eyes, my Lord Durrisdeer fell to the ground, and when I raised him up, he was a corpse. Day came, and still Secundra could not be persuaded to desist from his unavailing efforts. Sir William, leaving a small party under my command, proceeded on his embassy with the first light; and still the Indian rubbed the limbs and breathed in the mouth of the dead body. You would think such labours might have vitalised a stone; but, except for that one moment, which was my lord's death, the black spirit of the Master held aloof from its discarded clay; and by about the hour of noon even the faithful servant was at length convinced. He took it with unshaken quietude. "Too cold," said he. "Good way in India, no good here." And asking for some food, which he ravenously devoured as soon as it was set before him, he drew near the fire and took his place at my elbow. In the same spot, as soon as he had eaten, he stretched himself out and fell into a childlike slumber, from which I must arouse him some hours afterwards, to take his part as one of the mourners at the double funeral. It was the same throughout. He seemed to have outlived at once, and with the same effort, his grief for his master and his terror of myself and Mountain. One of the men left with me was skilled in stone cutting, and before Sir William returned to pick us up, I had chiselled on the boulder this inscription, with a copy of which I may fitly bring my narrative to a close: J.D., heir to a Scottish title, a master of the arts and graces, admired in Europe, Asia, America, in war and peace, in the tents of savage hunters and the citadels of kings, after so much acquired, accomplished, and endured, lies here forgotten. H.D., his brother, after a life of unmerited distress, bravely supported, died almost in the same hour,
and sleeps in the same grave with his fraternal enemy. The piety of his wife and one old servant raised this stone to both. End of chapter 12. Recording by Thomas Copeland. End of The Master of Ballantrae by Robert Louis Stevenson.